Good afternoon, colleagues.
Good afternoon.
Am I audible to everyone?
Good afternoon. Yes, you are.
Okay. All right. Yes, I'm greeting you from Pretoria. My name is Mabel Kekana. I am a member of the SACO HSD Executive Committee, and I'm greeting you today to welcome you to this webinar on spirituality and health that is going to be presented by our colleague and member of the Executive Committee for SACO HSD, Dr. Harold Ngongwane. Before I hand over to Dr. Ngongwane, I just want to briefly tell you a little bit about the South African Committee of Health Sciences Deans. This committee was formed in 2009 by the Deans of Health Science faculties as a member and network organization, collective decision-making with member institutions retaining their autonomy. At the inception, focus on health science education in the context of prevailing regulatory and strategic frameworks, looking at the Higher Education Act, National Health Act, Health Charter Strategic Framework and Human Resource in Health, National Human Resource Plan for Health, facilitating the optimization and transformation of academic activities in health science faculties to meet the healthcare research and social imperatives of South Africa. With all this said, I'd like to say the topic for the webinar today is well placed in the context of what SACO HSD stands for, and looking at the fact that we are in October, that we call it what is a mental health month. Together with breast cancer month. But yes, spirituality is something that we are experiencing, and our students and staff members in our different institutions are being challenged with. With all this said, I'd love to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Ngongwane. I didn't say much about his bio, except that he is a member of the Executive Committee of the South African Committee of Health Sciences Deans, and he is an education psychologist at UNISA. But I think because this topic is very close to his heart, he will introduce himself, give you his background, and then before he embarks on the presentation, Dr. Ngongwane, I would love to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, for this opportunity. I hope my camera is visible. And that,
I can see you nicely. Yes, you are visible.
I'm glad to hear that. And I wish to thank everyone who has spent their time to go through the webinar with us today. Indeed, this is one of the projects that we are working on as part of the Health Deans Committee. So allow me to just get straight to the point, and you will advise Program Director if the
slides are showing nicely. The slides are on. Yes, you are on slideshow now. Yes, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Since you saw me, I think maybe if I were to switch off my camera so that I can try to do my magic behind the scene.
And then I'm doing that as well, switching off my camera. But put your slides on slideshow. It was on slideshow, now it's out. Put it on slideshow, and then I'm muting myself as well.
Thank you so much. And I think it will allow other colleagues to also chime in without spending a lot of data. So the purpose of today's presentation, I'm going to be presenting on the guidelines on student inclusive support, integrating spiritual well-being into higher education health. The focus is more on mental health as one of the challenges that our students experience within the higher education sector. So this is one of the work that we are doing with the South African Committee of Health Science Deans, as it was explained before. I think Prof. Kekana has, from the University of Pretoria, has already explained my bio, but I maybe just to highlight a few things that I am actually a research psychologist that is doing research within the education management, education sector. And I think my research interest spans from student support, health and wellness. And I have a very deep passion for health and wellness in various contexts, particularly in higher education and how it affects students. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Just a few things, maybe in terms of etiquette, I'll skip these ones. I think they are pretty much straightforward, that we engage fruitfully and that we ensure that we participate in the chat as well. So in terms of the focus of the webinar, the standard operating procedures, we're going to look into that. We're going to look at the exploring the relationship between spiritual well-being and mental health, outline various models of student health and wellness, unpack the concept of inclusivity within a health and wellness perspective, and also look at how do we integrate issues of spiritual health and mental well-being and into mental health curricular discussions and as a form of support systems. So I think for this particular webinar, the first phase will be just for me to present just the grounding in terms of the foundational knowledge, so that by the time we get to the standard operating procedures or the guidelines, then there is a clear fundamental foundational knowledge that is being set. So within the South African Health Dean Committee, we embarked on a rigorous process in order to develop the guidelines. And I think this is, it's been over the process. It still started last year around June, and we are still in the process also to ensure that we finalize everything. So how it emanated that we conducted systemic literature review, and then we consulted with relevant stakeholders who are mainly focusing on who are at managerial level, directorship, and deanery level. We piloted the guidelines in various universities, and this is an ongoing project. And the next step would be to get feedback, and then today we're presenting the findings and the feedback with the intention of synthesizing and finalizing everything so that it can be used across all the different contexts within the university setting. So maybe let me start by defining the concept of spiritual calling, which is a term that is described as a person's profound feeling of direction or purpose, in which a person is connected to values, beliefs, and this may take form in different ways, such as serving others, belonging to a specific religion or philosophy, school of thought, where the pursuit is tailored on improving the self and also in the pursuit of knowledge. So frequently it entails a very intense deep drive where one's choices and behaviors are directed in a way to pursue meaning within human existence. And a person is also confined within spiritual convictions. So in terms of Afrocentric perspective, it's basically a simplistic way African cultural values and traditions that will be embedded to understand mental health and spiritual needs. They actually are intertwined with different facets of well-being, such as social, psychological, and physiological dimensions, where spiritual needs may pertain to religious beliefs, practices, and they may not always be related to religiosity. Maybe I think I need to highlight that. It's not always about religiosity or belonging to a particular religious. That is one way, but there's also a more of an existential dimension where a person seeks belonging, issues of identity formulation, and looks for meaning. And then obviously, mental health is a state of well-being that enables people to cope with stresses and to be able to contribute to the society. So there is intrinsic and the instrumental value, and obviously it's a basic human right. So I think I spoke about that traditionally African societies were organized around communal and spiritual principles where spirituality and community were intertwined with ancestrals and were central to daily life and mental health. So the Nguni proverb, the one that is very famous, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, a person is a person through other people's, it reflects a deep connection between the individual identity and communal relationships. But if you look at the integration of the Afrocentric perspectives for developing a culturally relevant and effective mental health interventions, we have been lacking in that regard, where there needs to be the incorporation of traditional values and spiritual calling into community health and mental health practices, so that these practices and interventions, they can be more aligned to the lived experiences of African individuals or individuals living in Africa. So that is why then we look at, there is the integration of religious and existential dimensions into mental health. And we also, that is more Afrocentric, but even if you look at from a Viktor Franklin's perspective using logotherapy, he speaks about meaning and religiosity, and he speaks about meaning and a sense of belonging, which is a more Western aspect in terms of understanding spirituality. So today I want to draw a link between spiritual well-being and mental health. So the link between that has been extensively documented, where spirituality is very crucial in terms of the holistic well-being, and it actually can form as a protective factor against psychological distress. And studies have found out that actually there is some kind of a link between spiritual well-being and mental health, where a positive correlation has also been noted, but also that a spiritual well-being is found to predict a student's mental health in one of the studies where they conducted a descriptive study. And then spiritual development has also been shown as a way to reduce depression, anxiety, and stress, where sources indicate that spiritual well-being is associated with a higher or a chance of lower spiritual well-being is associated with a higher chance of experiencing moderate or high anxiety. So we're already seeing the connection between the two. There's also a few studies where they found the inverse relationship with psychological distress, where higher spiritual well-being or religiousness is associated with lower levels of negative psychological symptoms. So you will see that there is that relationship between spiritual well-being and mental health. Now, if you look at spiritual well-being relating to psychological outcome, where the study that was done looking at the three concepts: connection with God, connection with self, personal and communal domain, you will see that also there is that a correlation between spiritual well-being and psychological outcomes. And within a space of higher education, these studies actually, they are within higher education. So that is something that to note. So what are we trying to do? Spiritual well-being can enhance positive mental states, where issues such as meaning and purpose are always tied to life satisfaction, purpose in life, where these are very important in terms of resilience, and also issues of psychological well-being, involvement in terms of religious activities, where in places or individuals that have strong spiritual well-being, they experience these concepts or feelings of happiness, and according to Nadifa, there's peace, contentment, and harmony. But also, spiritual factors act as a protective a factor where spirituality and religiousness enable individuals to cope with stress. So there's also studies on spiritual well-being and physical health, which I won't touch much on. So already we are already seeing that spiritual well-being has an impact on various aspects in terms of well-being. Now, I think maybe this relates more to the higher education, where of the drop between mental health and academic performance, where students with a good mental health practice or who are able to manage mental health are more likely to achieve better grades. And if you tie that, you bring the component of spiritual well-being, mental health, and academic performance as three core components, you'll see that a strong sense of purpose and meaning is correlated with students' better adjustments to university, where students, they're able to study effectively, they're able to show persistence, resilience, and they're able to commit to completing their studies. So there is a tie between mental health, spirituality, and academic performance that some studies have also picked up. So I think maybe coming back to the issue of mental health, we've seen that according to several studies, Yusuf, mental health is one of the prominent issues, where it was found that students that participated in a sample of 29,000 students across 19 universities, 15.4%, they actually had major depressive disorder. So, and with a 8.6, they were exhibiting or had some form of the manifesting of suicidal behavior, or suicidal ideation. So it shows that mental health is very key, but we need to understand it within other aspects such as spiritual well-being, for example. So I won't go much into this, but you'll see that 4 factors accounted in terms of the crisis helpline calls in 2022. Most of the individuals that were calling the crisis helplines, they reported experiencing anxiety. So, and then followed by depression. So already we show that in spaces where students are being assisted at higher education, anxiety and depression seem to be the most prevalent ones that are shaping the mental health sphere. So if we come back to the dimensions of wellness, I won't touch much into this, but you look at then what will be these dimensions and how they have an impact on spiritual well-being. So I've outlined some of the physical, the mental, and academic and financial, and focusing on how do we then create inclusive considerations. And if you look at these are the models of health and wellness, where these are contrasted into different themes and different components. I think one that is also, for example, the 8 dimensions of wellness, where it focuses on emotional, physical, social, intellectual, spiritual, environmental, and occupational and financial, where the whole notion is to provide a holistic view of wellness that is inclusive of diverse identities and lived experiences. So when you're thinking about that, we need to think about what does inclusive student wellness and support refers to. And this is about addressing the diverse health and well-being needs of the students, particularly those who are historically margined and are vulnerable groups, through a more integrated, a more equitable, and culturally responsive system within a higher education. And if you think about it, that a more inclusive wellness models, they show that they are more associated with better social outcomes, and they improve peer interactions, and they are very important for the social development and academic development of students. So let's dive into terms of the inclusive student wellness and support. There are 5 components that one needs to take into consideration. One is the multi-dimension, which we focus on. The second one is context sensitive, where we look at issues such as spirituality, students' race, gender, disability. Then you look at a proactive and holistic, understanding that the models and interventions, they need to be proactive and holistics, rather than reactive or remedial. So we need to design approaches that are to prevent issues before they arise, and to collaborate with different partners in order to ensure that students have access to inclusive support. So when we think about inclusivity, we think about that we need to embrace diversity to ensure accessibility and responsiveness to students' identities. So students that come from different spaces need to be catered for, but also the other component relates to wellness, where student support, it needs to be structured, or it can be informal resources. So these are some of the examples that are sort of novel in terms of inclusive student wellness. One that I think it touches and is the cornerstone of this webinar. It's on culturally relevant health promotion campaigns. And there's also others which are more digital. And the first one there, it talks about multilingual counseling services. And so these ones are sort of innovative in a way. And the other one, quiet rooms for prayer, meditation, or sensory needs. These are coming from some of the universities that have started to work on inclusive student wellness. So I think we are then in a better position to be then moving towards the guidelines of integrating spirituality into mental health. So we developed this framework where often which offers health educators, policy makers, different individuals that function within a university settings to incorporate spiritual calling and mental health, or spiritual well-being into higher education health. So if you look at the impact on mental health, so this document that I'm going to be sharing with you today, it shows that a clear sense of spiritual calling can enhance resilience by offering individuals a framework for information and overcoming demanding situations. So, and then students who align themselves with spiritual ideals, they consistently report higher degrees of satisfaction and success. This then aligns to the potential where students are able to deal with issues of purpose, finding purpose, and contentment in life. So spiritual ideals can provide valuable coping mechanisms and support structures for individuals to manage stress and to overcome adversity. So in some cases, these are some of examples like meditation, prayer can be effective tools for dealing with lifestyle difficulties. What happens when the students are not provided support, or they neglect the spiritual component? Is that there tends to be existential crisis where a student can then encounter a conflict between their beliefs and reality. So, for an example, a student would say, this is what I believe in, but this is the reality. And when there is a disjuncture between beliefs and reality, then there's going to be an existential crisis. When there's an existential crisis, it means that other facets of well-being, they are most likely to be affected. So that's why it's essential for health educators to be equipped to support students, or even student counselors or practitioners to be equipped to support students who experience such crisis. So one of the things that come about the literature is spiritual distress, where there's an inconsistency between the non-public beliefs and the actual stories. So this is why educators need to provide support or referral to assist students to navigate their spiritual challenges. And I'm going to show how the model, how it does not rely on educators, but how a more integrated approach which embodies existing systems within communities can be infused, using strategic partnerships to be able to deal with mental health, using spiritual well-being to deal with mental health, and creating those partnerships to assist the development of spiritual well-being so that it can have a ripple effect on other facets of well-being. So if you look at the guidelines, it then gives you the roles of different stakeholders, which are important in integrating spiritual development into mental health education. So, for an example, if you look at point 2.4 in the document, which will be shared, is that it focuses on that educators are responsible for designing and enforcing a curriculum that integrates religious development and mental health by incorporating content that explores these religious ideals and the effect it has on mental well-being. So if you think about our curriculum, that is inclusive, that is within understanding that there is the spiritual component which can affect mental health. Educators can also facilitate instructions and discussions which can explore and articulate spiritual ideals, and to ensure that also the inclusive surroundings as they mature and develop. The educators can also develop evaluation tools to gauge students' comprehension of the impact of religious development on mental health, and to also gauge professional improvement to enhance the understanding of integrating spirituality into education. So if we think about the context here, is that you have a mental health professional or a health educator or a health professional that is providing an intervention to a student that is having spiritual identity crisis or spiritual distress. In certain ways, we can either assist that patient to within their own lived experiences or within their lens of reality, or we can impose a westernized view that whatever they're experiencing is foreign to the Western perspective, and therefore it should be classified as a pathology. And that is the problem. That is problematic, because then what happens to understanding that there is a possibility of a reality that can be conclusive, and that a reality that can be valid for that particular patient or student. And then, notwithstanding that, there could be spiritual challenges that may affect the academic well-being and mental health, and that if they are not addressed within a right frame, if the student is not referred or if not supported, then it is bound to have those ripple effect. And then as a higher education, we are saying, then what is the role of the university in providing support for every dimension of wellness, with a notion in mind that spiritual well-being can also be an instrument for mental health, for resilience, can also be a support system for academic well-being, and that it can also have a ripple effect on other facets such as financial distress, psychological distress, that we need to, as universities, to think about how do we really also pay attention and focus on this component. So what is then the role of the students? Obviously, then they become the center of intervention, where in some cases they can participate in extramural activities, reflective practices, journaling, meditation, in order to get an insight into their spiritual or religious journey as a form of coping strategies. So students then are also a critical component of feedback, a source of feedback into issues of curriculum, into issues of counseling, and they can provide that feedback in terms of whether the services are relevant to their needs. So within, obviously now the demographics have changed, where we are having younger and younger population, then it then focuses on how do parents and guidance as a system that exists with outside the university can also be a form of support. It now comes to us, the universities, and how different different individuals, such as school directors, should be responsible for developing policies and regulations that facilitate the inclusion of religious development within the curriculum, while ensuring that they respect diverse religious ideals. And there needs to be allocation of resources to also focus on specific programs that are holistic, and to monitor those programs to make sure that they also align to the university institutional values, and to also support professional development for educators focusing on spiritual development and well-being. So what is then the role of mental health professionals? They need to offer expert guidance on the intersection of religious improvement and mental health. So the counseling services, for example, they need to address mental health, not in isolation, right? So a couple of years ago, I was involved in a project where we were working with inmates in a correctional facility, and they had changed their identity from being a convict, but to become a religious leader within the correction setting. So they use spirituality as a form of support. The article, I think it's there online. that they use spirituality as a form of support to cope with psychological distress. And obviously that is a different setting, but it shows that there is that relations. Secondly, mental health professionals, they need to collaborate with educators to develop approaches that integrate spiritual improvement into mental health and to contribute to training educators who will support the university students' spiritual improvement. So lastly, mental health professionals should incorporate Afrocentric principles in practice, respecting cultural, spiritual beliefs while providing mental health support. I think that is very important, that mental health professionals, we understand the scope that we work in, understand that the client might present in a very Afrocentric perspective in terms of how they articulate their challenges, and one needs to take that into consideration even when having those conversations and developing some kind of an intervention. That we need to be flexible, understanding that we are psychologists in Africa, we are African psychologists, and clients will have clients who with different historical and cultural and political origins. So I think I spoke about that spiritual counselors, the role on how they can get involved. And I think I'm going to skip this one. I think if you look at the National Health System framework, you will note that the traditional healers or traditional leaders, it's one of the components of dealing in the public health sector. I think the national public health system framework in South Africa, traditional leaders, they are also a integral component. And we had a very classic example of a colleague that was sharing that a student was sitting in a class and they started to present certain manifestations which were in isiZulu, we say uvukela umoya, for an example. That is a certain experience where a person is now in touch with their a higher being and manifesting certain symptoms that are bodily, physiological, and there is some kind of a covert behavior that shows that this person is sort of somewhere else and not here. And they said the person was manifesting that amadlozi and so on, which ancestral calling. So they then did not know how to deal with that student. And if you take that student and you send them to a very westernized psychologist, that student will be diagnosed with schizophrenia, because then they will say, I see things, I hear things. But within an Afrocentric perspective, that reality is allowed, that reality is valid. So, and the challenges were that student will now be ostracized, isolated, and without even getting the relevant support. And some of the colleagues, they were sharing in the committee that they actually now started to collaborate with traditional leaders in spaces where they cannot assist the student. Then we talk about them collaborating, where some of the nurses actually, they were also experienced the same thing as their patients would present certain manifestations, spiritual manifestations, and they had to take those nurses and take them to a traditional leader, a healer, and then to be orientated to say, if a person manifests in this way, you must refer, for an example, and accept that this is not necessarily your terrain to function in, but you need to refer. And this is talking about the issues of power balance. To say, when do you refer? And as a mental health professional, you have a role to play, and you also understand that you operate within a system, an ecological system where other sources and systems operate, and that those you might need to, for example, refer a student to a more Afrocentric orientated psychologist, for example. So, and then it ties us to then policymakers in terms of academic institution, that we need to develop regulations to guide the integration of spiritual development into our curriculum, to make sure that these guidelines, they address the importance of spiritual aspects of mental health. And I think I spoke about the issues of allocating resources for intervention and so on. So what is then the role of community organizations? And in the guidelines, we specifically state that a university is not a university in isolation, but it exists within a system, that there are also other resources that are there within a community space where community groups, non-governmental organizations, they can play an important role in the mental health, education, resources, and applications, and also inform some of the frameworks. But also, if you think about also how can we then leverage on some of these community organizations that are working on spiritual development and so on, then they can also provide insight into our programs and provide workshops, and they also advocate for the inclusion of these ideas in our education. And this will then also have an impact in terms of resources and literature. So researchers are also at the foreground of these guidelines, where their role in the university is to examine the intersection of spiritual improvement, mental health training, preventing evidence-based recommendation for integration. They are also tasked to share findings with educators, health professionals, policymakers, in order to contribute to the improvement of instructional resources. So here we're not only thinking about at the policy level, but we also think about how can research be used to be able to affect issues of curriculum design and curriculum learning material, for example. So we have already now spoke about the university settings and closer relations, organizations and stakeholders, but also what is very key is how can we then integrate faith-based organizations into issues of spiritual well-being and mental health. So faith-based organizations, they are aligned with religious growth and calling, and some of them, they offer counseling, community engagement, and some of them, they offer academic sources. I've seen some of them, they having writing books on particular spiritual ideas, also simplifying it to a psychological level, and then spiritual, theological, and psychological perspective. All right, so we need to also collaborate with institution to ensure that as we develop our interventions, then they are also included, and curriculums, they are also part of that in terms of curricula. And we need to engage with educators and mental health professionals. So their role is also to include that and community groups to enrich educational initiatives. So faith-based organizations are very critical in terms of these guidelines, because then in most of the time within a space where our students may not necessarily always have access to a counselor, for an example, within a distance learning institution, then they become a form of a community health system, a community system subset where students can benefit from that fraternity. So what are the values? So these are the values that guide that we need to think about: creating a respectful environment where educators can play a role in fostering the environment that respects and values diverse spiritual beliefs. So in order to do this, we need to establish clear recommendations for discussions about spiritual beliefs to ensure that there is inclusivity. We need to create opportunities for students to express themselves, understand that we may have personal bias that may impact interactions with our students, and we must strive for impartiality to ensure that our personal beliefs do not influence our teaching and interactions with students. So these are some of the example in terms of inclusive practice, where you use language that respects, incorporate religious viewpoints into curriculum materials, engage in self-reflection and training to identify and address any potential bias. So if you know that you work with students that have different spiritual beliefs, you need to engage in critical self-reflection, and you must also always, educators should actively search and recognize and challenge their own assumptions and prejudice. So it's a space of reflection to say, how do I work with such students who have diverse spiritual callings or spiritual ideologies that may also present within a counseling setting or within a classroom setting, for an example. So issues of confidentiality, they're very important, especially within an Afrocentric spiritual development, that we need to ensure that we avoid disclosing sensitive information. And now there's issues of also maintaining, ensuring that the data of the students is safe, the POPI Act, and following the institutional guidelines in terms of, especially when it comes to referral and how we refer specific students with mental health or spiritual challenges. Okay, so it developed a confidential protocols, but this is just a summary. University need to develop this and ensure that students are informed about these protocols and understand how their information will be handled. We need to also provide training for employees regarding confidential practices and the importance of maintaining privacy. And I think this is the reason why some students are not seeking mental health interventions, because they are not sure if they ask. And it's not about just mental health professionals. They are trained to keep that. They are obligated to ensure confidentiality. But the question is, even on a Ubuntu level, a very confidential level, that if I ask a security guard, where can I see a psychologist? Or do I feel that that information, that person will be confidential, or they will then share with the next person that this person asked me where can they see a psychologist on campus? So it's a very important thing that these principles, they need to be embedded across all the functionalities within a university setting. So professional conduct, I think I did mention some component there. that we must adhere to ethical standards. We must ensure that we present records in a way that is objective, avoid promoting personal beliefs. And as a university, we ensure that we facilitate discussions that encompasses diverse viewpoints and recognize all participants' perspectives, identify and address conflicts of interest. Within a space that is evolving, I think there is no substitution for professional development, that educators, practitioners, policymakers, they need to be constantly involved in professional development. And professional development, in this case, relates to issues on sensitivity, diversity, and how how do you then become more sensitive, allow more diversity, and ensure that you treat students with respect, and that it's easier for students to come to you. And then, but also we need training to be able to understand the intersectionality between spirituality and mental health, and components and avenues such as workshops, conferences, and training are important. And we need to stay informed about current developments. And one development is that the South African health deans is that we developed this document that will be able to assist universities to be able to integrate these concepts and to ensure that there is inclusive support. And obviously, I think issues of reading literature, these are pretty much standard, that you should always be abreast with the latest developments in the space. So how do we then integrate these strategies? I mean, I seem to be talking about a lot of integration. So let me just try to simplify or operationalize it. For an example, define goals for integrating spiritual calling or spiritual health into mental health. Ensure that your objectives, they align with academic standards that will deal with spiritual and mental well-being. You need to develop specific plans that include issues of religious calling or spiritual well-being and its impact on mental health. This is referring to those that are doing, providing, offering courses that are more human, let me say human science, public health, health sciences, social sciences. This is some of the activities that you can include. You need to have precise standard outcomes, strategies, and assessment methods. And this is actually about integrating these concepts into your curriculum. I'm just going to name a few and then we move. And then you can integrate things like reflective journaling, like discussions, role play activities. And you can also get feedback from students, colleagues, and other stakeholders to assess the progress. You develop a schedule for reviewing and updating curriculum, and you regularly assess and update the relevance and the effectiveness of learning material as required. And I think the activities that you integrate, they need to be enticing, they need to be interactive for the students to journey and find themselves without or notwithstanding the whole purpose of learning a particular course subject So I think these are some of the examples, practical, that one can do. I think I spoke about feedback mechanisms. How do we know that some of these things have been integrated? So we think about conducting surveys, we analyze, we can also do focus groups with students, educators, to discuss the curriculum, to see if these have been integrated, and to look at the overall effectiveness. So how can we then assist student to then, for an example, a student that presents a challenge that is within the scope of practice, then let's think about how we can create resources and support. For an example, here, this slide, I think it covers compiling a list of available mental health services, including contact details of community health institutions and organizations and counseling services, include information on spiritual counseling offerings, and provide a list of online assets such as websites, platforms. Then you distribute, then ensure that these resources are available. And then for students with who are differently abled, then you can think about, how do I then convert these resources into multiple formats so that I can be able to accommodate students with different needs. I've outlined the referral procedure, that there is a way to refer, starting that you develop strategies, and then each university needs to have a protocol for referrals, and then they need to handle referrals with sensitivity and confidentiality. All the staff needs to be informed about this referral process. But we don't just refer, we also need to follow up with the student to see if they've been assisted. Notwithstanding the fact that as health educators, we need to also ensure that there is a space for the promotion of self-care. So students have to be encouraged to engage in self-care for their spiritual and mental well-being. They need to be also provided with tools and awareness on aspects such as mindfulness, meditation, and stress relief. We need to also organize workshops that focus on self-care and mental well-being. We need to also provide practical tools and techniques for managing stress, and we also need to incorporate community engagement. So talk about, we are almost there. We need to encourage our students to participate in communities or religious organizations that align with their beliefs and values. And we need to also that we coordinate institutional initiatives to promote a feeling of inclusion and community engagement. We also need to ensure that we organize events that facilitate the connections among students who share similar interests or beliefs. I think this one I'm going to skip it because I think I've already touched on how then issues of training and professional development, they are aligned with this presentation. So now we talk about expert consultation, where we need to seek guidance as health educators from mental health practitioners and religious experts to enhance the knowledge and application, and consult with professionals in integrating spirituality into mental health. Participate in consultations that will assist students in managing intricate issues or coping, and obtain expert advice on specific situation or topics relating to spiritual calling and well-being. And here, this one, I think, talks about collaboration, that we collaborate with educators, mental health professionals, religious counselors, and that we develop partnerships that offer expertise in both religious and mental health. Monitoring and evaluation, whatever guidelines that we propose, there needs to be a form of monitoring and evaluation. So we need to establish schedules for regular evaluations. When do we evaluate? And use different methodologies in order to ensure that we are able to get the information that is required. Okay, let me just run quickly in terms of the implication. So first, implications for strategy and policy development. So the first one, based on these guidelines, we need to promote a holistic student development approach by addressing the imbalances across all the wellness dimensions, including spirituality. Number 2, integrate spirituality into curriculum. 3, we need to train staff on how to incorporate spiritual well-being into teaching and learning. Number 4, how do we then we need to strengthen evaluation mechanisms to ensure that the well-being competencies to measure the well-being competencies and enhance resource utilization. So what are the implications for intervention and program implementation? Provide structural spiritual programs. We need to implement purpose-focused interventions to enhance meaning, enhance psychological capital. So how do we do this? Focus on these 4: hope, optimism, resilience, self-efficacy through interventions. Then we develop specific mental health programs that are addressing these issues: depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance-related behaviors. Then we need to prioritize support for high-risk groups, particularly first-year students. What are the implications for support services, those that are operating in that sector? Ensure that there is affordable or accessible psychological services. We provide a robust social and academic support. We leverage, for those that are in the residential universities, you need to leverage on residential life structure to reduce risky behaviors and promote positive attitudes. And then we foster a social space that promotes a sense of belonging. Okay, then we look at policymakers and organizations. They need to include spirituality in higher education, mental health policy to strengthen happiness, to strengthen academic success, encourage holistic healthcare that integrates spirituality and religiosity into professional practice, provide spiritual well-being support in high-stress occupations to reduce mental health risk, and then also promote cross-cultural research that understand cultural influence on spiritual well-being and performance. So if the guidelines that you'll be receiving, we developed a checklist. So this is a checklist that you can use. So it's divided into 14. So this is a summary of the guideline in terms of how you check. So policy frameworks, roles and responsibility, training, awareness, assessment and referral processes, confidentiality, ethical considerations, and so on. So these are the key elements that you need to look into when you want to then develop these guidelines, but also when you want to implement, you need to then use this checklist. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Harold, and thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I think that you have really given us a lot of food for thought.
I'm Pavi Pillay, for those of you who may not know me. I'm with Harold at the South African Committee of Health Sciences Deans. I don't know if you can see there's a person here. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to handle any questions if required. If there are any questions, I can facilitate that for you. Yes, we have LZ. Who is LZ? LZ, please go
Okay.
ahead.
Thank you.
Lindy, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Wow. Yeah, this topic is long overdue. And indeed, we have got diverse type of students here. And it looks like it's not only staff members that have to be trained. I think as together with the students, we really need more education on how to integrate this in the curriculum. Because currently we can't even accommodate certain spiritual students in a sense of like those ancestral with ancestral calling. Also, some of them require a room where they need to be and do their whatever they're supposed to do. And sometimes it's not at the same time as, you know, whether in the evening or whatsoever. And now it's very difficult to accommodate one student in that room. And it means that we really need to revisit, re-look on how we structure our setting in the universities. But it is true that we need to start from first year and then talk about these. And I'm glad to say that the interprofessional education, the IPECP, so far has started to help us to try to have these topics for first years. And I will really appreciate if we can also have whether the recording or the slides so that we can also share in our student senate life and wellness what has been discussed today. I'm calling from SMU. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Harold.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments. I think one of the components the aspects that Prof. Zikalala mentioned is relating to the inclusion of spiritual well-being at first year, and the fact that it's not only academics, but also it's not only students, but also staff that needs to be trained on such issues. And I'm also saying that even those that are operating at a policy level, because then they need to sort of assign resources and also integrate these in their policies. And thank you. So I think you've really hit on the nail that these are serious issues that have always been neglected, especially the issue of Ugutwasa and African ancestral calling. These need some kind of integration into our higher education frameworks of wellness. And the slide, I'm going to, yes, you'll receive the slide. I'm going to share the slide as well.
Thank you so much, Harold, for that response. Are there any further questions? Well, I just wanted to say that I think that you have touched on something that many of us feel daunted by. And you know what I really liked in this webinar was your practical solutions and your practical approach to it. And I think that this is something that we need to consider, looking at the series of other challenges that our students face today. And we need to make ourselves more culturally sensitive, as well as align our curriculum to what's going on the in the ground. it's time for us to dissolve ourselves or move ourselves a little bit further from the northern ideologies that, yes, if somebody is displaying a certain type of characteristic, be it seeing things or hearing things or whatever it is, then immediately we want to take them and diagnose them and put them into a labeled box. And we have to embrace our cultures, because I'm sure lots of people are misunderstood. And also the fact that we need to be more sensitive to the impact of how this impacts the student success rates as well. I think a lot of our students don't do well academically sometimes because they're dealing with these issues. So, Harold, is there anything else that you would like to say to your audience before? I'm sorry I didn't come in at the beginning. I think Mabel was there, but yeah, we're grateful that you took the time to share your passion with us, because I know that since the first day I met you, this is something that you are really passionate about, and you've put so much of work into it that I think that this one webinar, I wish there were more people who could, really unpack this. But I'd like to ask over to you, Harold, if there's anything that you would like to say before I do the vote of thanks. You muted, Harold.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you so
No.
much. Yeah, no, thank you so much to the colleagues for attending. I think I do think that also this is a lot of information that is provided in a very short space of time. I do believe that as colleagues get hold of the slides or the guidelines, then they will also interact with the document and the concept more rigorously. But I think this is not a collaborative space, but a space where we can discuss even offline, even through emails, where contributions are also still welcome. And definitely this is a project for all to have a voice, to contribute, because these issues, they affect us as health educators, as policy makers, as those that are in policy setting. So this is a call to everyone to not be shy, to, if there's anything that they want to ask or they want to send, they want to query or contribute, then they are welcome to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. I think you should pop your email address in the chat so that people can contact you directly. I think that may be useful. Yeah, so colleagues, I think this brings us almost to the end or the close of the webinar. But before we leave, I would like to please remind you to Harold's taken it off now to fill out the post-webinar evaluation that was online. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank our hosts or our colleagues from NMMU, Mr. Philippe Holzer, who put this all together at a very short space of time, as well as Mrs. Sanette Page, who helped also get all the logistics together. And of course, to Dr. Ngwane, who really gave us a lot to think about. And like to thank you all as well for participating and for listening. And I hope you take something valuable away from this webinar. So thank you so much, colleagues. Best wishes. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.